Hello, welcome to a video on Black-White Planeswalkers. This is a deck that I've been testing, brewing, playing around with for months now, on and off. I haven't really put as much time into it in the last several months as I have in the last, few weeks. Definitely been playing it more recently since the unbannings and for a little bit before the unbannings. So yeah, it's kind of my pet deck that I like to play and test and mess around with. The general idea of the deck is that you want to play a whole bunch of Planeswalkers to generate value and win the game, and then things that support those Planeswalkers. And the best way to support your Planeswalkers is to make sure that they live. So basically you have a giant pile of Planeswalkers, and then you have disruption and wraths and removal and token creation. And that basically gives all of your Planeswalkers time to do their thing and take over the game in whichever way that those Planeswalkers do. We'll start with lands and then go on to non-lands in a second. The most important thing is I'm playing 9 basics. This is really good for a lot of reasons. The color requirements on this deck are actually quite light. You need double white, and for the most part, you only need single black. There are 3 double black spells in the entire list, so you really don't need double black that often. And because of this, and because we need so many lands, it means that our color requirements are relatively lax. And you tend to have enough time to find all of your stuff, and as long as you get your cards out of your hand relatively at a relatively decent pace, you can stay alive long enough that having a little bit, I don't want to quite call it worse mana, but less painful mana is slightly less consistent at getting the colors you want, but at the same time, well, less painful. I'm not fetching and shocking anywhere near as much as most other people most of the time. I just, fetch a basic. I'm very proof against Blood Moon, since I can very easily just draw my way out of a Blood Moon, especially if I know it's coming. I just fetch a swamp, and then I've probably drawn a basic plains or 2. Any of the people that are playing you a whole bunch of land destruction, doesn't matter. Like, Ghost Quarter me all you want. I've got plains for days. So that's a really nice aspect of the deck that I really enjoy, is having so many basics protects us from a lot of the more annoying shenanigans that people can do. Next part is 3 Field Ruin. These are just really nice value against a lot of decks. You can just color screw off, like, destroy the only blue source out of 4-color Traverse Shadow, or destroy the only green source out of Burn, or kill the Tron lands, because against Tron, this deck is kind of not great. So, oh yeah, I'll say that up front. This is a mid-rangey deck, and mid-rangey decks hate playing against Tron. I've won some games, I've won some matches against Tron, but it's not a good matchup. So as long as you accept the fact that you are playing a mid-range deck that is not great against Tron, because that's exactly what Tron wants to fight against, you'll be happy if you accept that you will grab some losses here and there to Tron. Anyways, so Field of Ruin's pretty good. It's the nice thing is, while it doesn't tap for any color of mana, it still fixes your mana. So, like, sure, it's kind of slow, but on turn 3, you play your Field of Ruin, you blow up their land, you get your own land, you cast your Fatal Push, Inquisition of Kozilek, Path to Exile. It's not the fastest if you really need to fix your color, but they'll get the job done at least. Alright, moving on. We've got some dual lands in Godless Shrine and Isolated Chapel. For the most part, Isolated Chapel is what we need. It is just perfect. We have so many basics, really easy time turning it on. And then Godless Shrine is a little bit more painful, but it's pretty easy to find a spot to fetch it tapped and just untap with it naturally, or sometimes you just really gotta have your dual land because maybe you drew all of your colorless lands. We have 4 fetches because fetches are excellent They get whatever color we need, and they find us basics. They're just good. 3 Shambling Vent. The manlands are pretty nice in this deck. Shambling Vent in particular is exactly what this kind of deck wants. The lifelink is really important. 2/3 blocks pretty decently against a lot of things. You know, random tokens, smaller beaters from like burn. You know, it blocks a Goblin Guide really well. Even if it's kind of a bit mana intensive to do that. And just chipping in for some life gain in the mid to late game is nice. You know, you wrath the board, neither of you do for anything for a few turns, and you get in there for, you know, 4 life with Shambling Vent. It's not insignificant. Lastly, there's 2 utility lands, one in Vault of the Archangel, which is really nice. Sometimes you get pretty low on life because, well, you're kind of a control deck and aggro decks beat you in the face, and then you start turning the tide, but you don't really have a whole ton of life left, and you're worried about burn range. Well, you animate a couple of Gideons and activate Vault of the Archangel. You'll gain a lot of life really fast by just like, oh yeah, well, I'm beating you for 9 with Gideons. Both of them have lifelink. Here we go. I'm back up to 20, and that puts you well outside of burn range. It's also really nice with all of the token generation we have from Lingering Souls and Gideon and Ally of Zendikar. You just, you know, play Lingering Souls, flash it back. You've got 4 tokens, have a Vault of the Archangel untap. Yeah, attack into my 4, you know, 1/1 flying Death Touch lifelinks. Good luck with that. Oh, nice Thought Knot Seer you got there. So Vault of the Archangel, you know, it does some good work sometimes. And then Westvale Abbey, well, flipping it into a 9/7 is pretty damn awesome. It's relatively realistic to flip it, because basically to flip it you need a Lingering Souls plus 1 other creature. And you can have your 1 other creature by Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, pumping out another token. You could even sacrifice Gideon at the Trials to it. You could spend the 5 mana to create a token. And honestly, 5 mana and 1 life to make a 1/1 white and black human token, it's not the greatest deal, but sometimes you just have a ton of lands and neither of you or your opponent are doing anything because you've 1-for-1'd each other out of the game. So I've used that mode a decent amount too. So that's the land base. Now let's go and start talking about the spells. So the first and very important part is 12 disruption spells in the 1 mana slot. Half of them are discard in Inquisition of Kozilek and Thoughtseize, leaning towards the Inquisitions, mostly just to try to take as little damage as possible out of our spells. I mean, as kind of a mid-range deck with a very high curve, you do take a bit of a beating in the early game against faster decks, and losing extra 2 lives against burn because you're playing Thoughtseizes or something is not something you want. But hand discard is some of the best cards in Modern for a very good reason. They're definitely amazing against the control and counterspell decks. They're amazing. They're just good. Fatal Push, Path to Exile. I mean, I don't really need to explain why removal is a good thing to have. And then 2 Collective Brutalities kind of round out the difference between the two. You know, it's a discard card when you want it, it's a kill spell when you need it, and it's a drain spell when you're really getting beat down. It's a way to discard cards if you want to, like, ditch a Lingering Souls for some reason. For the most part, you don't tend to escalate it for 3, but it also does a great job against burn, and it just is nice and flexible for 2 mana. I think that's all you really need to ask for. Knight's Whisper is mostly just to have a little bit more card draw. I found the deck was a little low on it, and also, crucially, it fits in the 2 slot pretty well. We don't really have anything that bridges the gap from Inquisition and the 1 mana removal spells into the 3 and 4 drops. And Knight's Whisper is just nice, like if you're on the play, just jam it, turn 2, draw your cards. There's not a lot of great card selection in black or white, like we don't get blue for Search for Azcanta or anything like that. So it's just a nice little cantrip. Well, better than cantrip, I guess. Draw card spell. It's not the greatest card, but it fulfills a role that I need just a little bit of, and it's relatively efficient at 2 mana. All right. Moving into the 3-drop slot, or the 3s, we get to the important stuff. Lingering Souls. This card, it does it all. Like, make a bunch of chump blockers, chump block to protect your Planeswalkers, pump it up with Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, Emblem, you know, trade off with their things. Great when you discard it to Collective Brutality on the flashback. Awesome value. Just Lingering Souls is amazing. And everyone who plays Modern has played against Lingering Souls and knows how good it is. You know, it's obnoxious for control decks to deal with it because they hate, you know, 4 1/1 Flying Spirit tokens. That's really hard to, like, 1-for-1 this profitably. Like, I had a game against Jund where my Jund opponent played 3 Abrupt Decays and a Lightning Bolt to deal with 1, you know, Lingering Souls card. It's a 4-for-1. It was so unfair. He just didn't have anything else to do with his cards, and he had to do it, but it is such good value. So Lingering Souls is excellent. Gideon of the Trials. He's great against single large threats. So against the Tarmogoyf type decks, or against Death Shadow, or against Eldrazi decks, he really just buys you a lot of time. You plunk him down, tick up on a big thing. He takes up to 4, which is a pretty good number. Doesn't die in 1 hit to, like, a Bloodbraid Elf, or to, most critically, when you take him up to 4, he doesn't die to, like, Lightning Bolts, which is really nice against Burn, because you, like, play it and you tick it up on his, you know, Eidolon or Guide, and then they can't bolt it, and then on your turn, you wipe the board or whatever and make an emblem, and then they have to spend 2 bolts to kill it, and all of their other burn now has to kill all of your Planeswalkers. The 0 emblem on this thing, against some decks it doesn't matter, and against some decks it's just randomly hilariously brutal. Like, I was playing against the weirdest, like, the Dice Factory deck, I think it was called, where they, you know, go off with, like, Paradox Engine and a whole bunch of things with charge counters and win by decking you out with some bell that makes you draw cards. And just, like, I don't know, I played a Gideon at the Trials and zeroed the emblem, and he was like, oh, I don't have a way to beat Gideon. I can't beat Gideon emblem. So there's a lot of weirder decks that just are stone dead to a Gideon of the Trials emblem. Ad Nauseam, for one, also really hates Gideon of the Trials. And also just, it protects you pretty well, and turning into a soldier and getting sideways is it's a 3 mana 4/4 indestructible. That's a pretty good beater. So anyways, Gideon of the Trials does a lot of work. The next part is we got 5 Wraths. You got a little bit of variety. You got Day of Judgment, Bantu's Last Reckoning, Damnation, and Wrath of God. So these 4 are basically completely interchangeable, although 1 of them uses double black and 3 of them use double white. The reason I'm playing the one of Day of Judgment instead of another Wrath of God and the Damnation, and to some extent the Bantu's Last Reckoning, is because there's that Humans deck, and they like to play this Meddling Mage card, and when you have 4 differently named Wraths in your deck, they have a really hard time naming the right Wrath. So Humans been on the decline a little bit in the last few days, but it's hilarious. When they play Meddling Mage on Wrath of God and then you Day of Judgment them, it's just the best feeling. Monty's Last Reckoning, the downside is annoying, but honestly, if you wrath the board, oftentimes you make up for it by the... Your land's not untapping, it is not the biggest deal, and sometimes the fact that it's 3 mana, it just really saves you if you've been, like, low on lands that game and just really got a wrath real quickly. So it's done work. The wraths are definitely a key part of this deck. It just doesn't work without them. But having so many, you're just like, all right, well, I'm going to throw some discard at you, and then I'm going to get a Planeswalker, and I'm going to set it up so the Planeswalker lives by, like, chumping with some Lingering Souls tokens. Also, by the way, don't be afraid of wrathing away a couple of your Lingering Souls tokens. Like, play the Lingering Souls tokens so they have to commit more to the board and then wrath them all away and flash back your Lingering Souls. You still got a few, and your deck has enough value that you can spew a little bit by being more defensive and making things more annoying for your opponent. Alright, Wrath of Gods are awesome. And now everything left is Planeswalkers. Gideon, an ally of Zendikar, is your best threat at just, like, closing the game. Play it down, make a 2/2 knight, start beating face, make an emblem, making all of your other Lingering Souls and Gideon things. Just like, this guy was a house in Standard. If you played Standard at all when this guy was legal, he was there, and he was obnoxious, and if you didn't play him a bunch, you really, really hated playing against him. And maybe if you played it with him, you also hated playing against him. I never played this card in Standard, and I just hated it so much. Anyways, this card is really, really, really good. Gideon Jura, great, just kind of like comes down, kills a big creature, turns into a guy and starts beating face, makes them all forced to attack him. Having everything forced to attack him gives you a lot of breathing room. If you can get both the smaller Gideons in play and just be like, alright, well, everything you have is forced to attack Gideon. Your biggest thing does nothing. Your smallest thing dies to the Gideon Knight token, and then the big Gideon survives anyways because I've got some Lingering Souls, and then I start killing all your stuff. It's just good. Like, very rarely do you cast Big Gideon and just have him die horribly, and even if he did, he'd probably save your bacon for a turn, at least. So he's been doing some pretty good work. And also just, it's a third Gideon for the Gideon of the Trials emblem, which sometimes really matters. You're playing against some burn deck, and you play the Gideon of the Trials emblem, and having 3 different Gideons means your opponent will never kill you, because getting all 3 of these off the board is extremely obnoxious. Ob Nixilis, I found that I kind of just needed a bit more card draw, so I was looking into ways in black and white to get a little bit more card draw, and Ob Nix is, well, not the first thing that most people think of when they think of modern playable Planeswalkers. He does a pretty good job, though. For 5 mana, he comes down, takes up to 6 loyalty, and draws you a card to replace himself. Like, Jace Brainstorm gives you more card selection, but at least he's not gaining loyalty, and he starts at 3. And then, I mean, you can also just play him as a removal spell that leaves behind a Planeswalker that threatens to draw you a card every turn for the rest of the game until they kill it. And if you ever get to -8, you basically just win, because your opponent's going to burn to death really, really quickly. So, Ob Nix has been pretty damn good. I've been very happy with him. And routing out the top of the curve, we got Sorin Grim Nemesis, which, according to the Reddit thread that some people played, they had no idea why I was playing Sorin Grim Nemesis over Elspeth, well, the good Elspeth. The 6 mana one. Yeah, Sun's Champion, there we go. That one. Mostly, I'm playing this Sorin because I didn't really need more of the effects that the Elspeth Sun's Champion did. Like, her plus was kind of like Lingering Souls, and I already had Gideon, ally of Zendikar, as token generation, and her minus, like, it kills a bunch of things, but doesn't kill everything, and I could also just play a Wrath of God, and, I mean, sure, her ult wins the game, but what expensive Planeswalker's ult doesn't win the game, so she just kind of felt redundant with what I already had, you know? Now, Sorin gives you an interesting bit of reach, just drawing you a bunch of cards, and, well, sort by converted mana cost again. This is an expensive mana curve when you're reverse bobbing, when you're reverse Dark Confidanting and just being like, oh yeah, oh look, I flipped an ally of Zendikar. I draw an ally of Zendikar, and you lose 4 life. You actually just have a very real clock on your opponent. Just by plussing, you kill them in a few turns because you're just like, oh look, big Planeswalker, you take a bunch of damage, and I have a big Planeswalker. He can also just come down and kill basically anything on the board and gain you a bunch of life doing it. Like, if you need to come back from being behind, play a giant Planeswalker, kill your biggest guy, gain a ton of life, is a nice move. I can't say that I've ever ulted him. Really, just like plussing him does enough. I've been very happy with Sorin Grim Nemesis. I've never cast him and felt, wow, this is a bad card to cast. Every time I've cast him, he felt awesome. but I guess that's what you expect out of your 6-mana Planeswalkers, right? Alright, moving over to the sideboard. Fragmentizes hit actually quite a wide variety of really annoying artifacts and enchantments, and there's not a lot of artifacts or enchantments that Fragmentize doesn't hit. So I kind of like the 1-mana aspect of it compared to, say, something like Disenchant. The fact that a sorcery speed also is pretty irrelevant. You can hit things like Search for Azcantas, Eidolon of the Great Revel, if you're sideboarding out cards that you don't want. It's hilarious against Boggles, killing their totem armors. Obviously, it's a house against Affinity or any artifact deck like Lantern or Eggs or, what have you. Fragmentize is just kind of well-rounded. Leyline of Sanctity, it's great against some combo decks. It's great against Burn. It's nice to have the interaction where Leyline of Sanctity protects all of your Planeswalkers from getting burned. I found it being less good in the mid-range matchups than I would have liked, even against the ones that have discard, because it turns out that you're just fine if they play a bunch of discard. Like, you don't have any critically annoying targets that you'd want to protect except for your Wraths at the wrong times. The only time I'm like, wow, I really wish my opponent didn't have any discard effects is when I get Thought-Knot Seared by some Eldrazi player and they take out my Wrath effect. But on the whole, Leyline of Sanctity is still good. Like, you play it against Burn and they just weep. And Burn is definitely still enough of a deck that it's worth considering. Rule of Law for Storm, for combo, for annoying decks that play a lot of spells, and when you want a Rule of Law is pretty darn good. One of the things we have more trouble with is graveyard-based decks, and that's why I have the full 4 Rest in Peace. So if I am playing against a graveyard deck, they will not have a graveyard for very long. Rest in Peace is just... I mean, you can kind of tell by this pile of 10 cards. I'm just playing 10 of the most obnoxious enchantment-based white hate cards in the format. People just... Whichever deck doesn't want to see these cards, when they come down, you feel awful about yourself. You're just like, oh god, why? Why me? Try playing Dredge into a Rest in Peace. Try playing Lantern or Affinity into Stony Silence. They're not fun. I can tell you this with confidence as someone who has played with a deck that hates Stony Silence. I don't like Stony Silence coming into play against me. So I think that's one of the main attractions. You just have so many cards that just hose decks. Because you're just like, oh, yeah, I'm playing white, so I have this card in my deck. Or sideboard. And it makes your deck weep. And then the last thing, which I think is going to be the weirdest for most people out of all of the cards. Cranial Extraction. I don't like losing to combo. And Cranial Extraction says, good luck with your combo deck, sir. You will not combo against me. Yeah, casting that against Ad Nauseam is hilarious. There's a whole bunch of other times when Cranial Extraction is great, but there's all kinds of decks I'd side in with, and it's great. Anyway, so that's the explanation of the deck. I'm sorry it took a while, and I'll see you for the first match of the league in a second.